The day of reckoning is finally here. No justice, no peace for too many years. We're marching for equality in every state, choosing love over violence, brutality, and hate. We're gonna stand up for what is right. We're gonna stand up, red, black, brown, and white. We're gonna stand up, trans, gay, and straight, 'cause it's the right thing to do.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pete Karamanis. I'm a member of the advisory board of the TomTom Foundation and a founding member of the Charlottesville law firm Royer Karamanis. On behalf of the TomTom board and our team, I want to thank you each for being here. Today's event is part of a 7-week virtual event series called the Cities Rising Summit. Cities Rising will explore critical issues surfaced by the COVID-19 pandemic and movement for racial justice, especially as they relate to small and mid-sized cities in America. All Cities Rising events will be available on a pay-what-you-can basis, thanks to the support of our sponsors and community members like you. If today's program resonates with you, please consider becoming a contributing member to the foundation. You can do so on our website, tomtomfoundation.org/give. The Cities Rising Summit will run until October 30th, and we encourage you to get as involved as possible over the course of the coming weeks. Join us at weekly meet and greets and interactive changemaker sessions, connect on our Slack workplace, and please email our team anytime with your questions and feedback. All talks throughout Cities Rising will be recorded, so if you enjoy today's session, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share it with colleagues and friends. Please note that the chat function in the bottom corner of your screen can be used to connect with other participants on the call today, and you can share your own experience around these issues. Also, please use that function to ask questions of our speakers. Our moderator will have their eyes on that channel and will include your questions and insights into how they steer today's conversation. The title of today's talk is The Next Wave of Prosecution and features 3 of the 11 Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice: Stephanie Morales, Dehgani-Tafti, and Jim Hingley. Today's event is part of a week of programs centered around criminal justice reform and is brought to you by SIVA Weekly, who we thank for their incredible support and collaboration. With that, I am pleased to introduce to you our moderator for today, Miriam Krinsky, who serves as Executive Director of Fair and Just Prosecution, an organization and resource for newly elected prosecutors seeking a smarter and more equitable justice system. Miriam also brings to us her expertise and insight from 15 years as a federal prosecutor. Miriam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Pete. And I'd like to thank the TomTom Foundation for setting the stage for this conversation and for the incredible program that you've hosted over these series of weeks with speakers that are really some of the most enlightened and creative minds in our nation. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation today with 3 elected prosecutors, 3 Commonwealth attorneys in Virginia, who inspire me every day, who model not just for their community, but also for the entire nation, what it means to be a 21st century prosecutor and what it means to seize this moment that we find ourselves in. We have joining us first, Dehgani-Tafti, who is the Arlington County and City of Falls Church Commonwealth's attorney. Parissa was elected in November of 2019 and came to that office with a 20-year record of having been active and acknowledged for her efforts to bring about criminal justice reform, including time as the legal director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, as well as her work as a public defender and a law professor, and so much more, including the heart that she brings to this work. Jim Hingley is the Albemarle County Commonwealth's attorney. He was elected in November of 2019 as well, and brings 44 years experience as a criminal trial lawyer including 25 years as a chief public defender. Not the normal pathway to elected prosecution, but we'll talk in a minute about the unusual nature of what is sweeping the country in terms of prosecutors who are heading offices from coast to coast. And also we have with us in some ways sort of the veteran of the group, Stephanie Morales, who's the Portsmouth Commonwealth's attorney. Stephanie was elected in 2015 and in assuming office became the first woman to be elected Commonwealth's attorney for her jurisdiction. She was re-elected in 2017 and has committed her office to a community prosecution model, and also is one of the acknowledged leaders in the country in terms of efforts fearlessly and boldly to bring about police accountability and really tread on turf that too many have been fearful of treading on. Let me set a bit of the stage before we launch ahead. So as I mentioned earlier, this is not what used to be the face of elected prosecution. Up until 2016, only 1% of elected prosecutors in our nation were women of color. We feel very fortunate that those paradigms are changing. They're changing in terms of the demographic, they're changing in terms of the background, and they're changing in terms of the values and experience of people who are assuming these offices. We see around the country a growing number of jurisdictions and communities that want something different. They want to move away from past failed, tough on crime approaches. They no longer believe that we can punish our way out of individuals who are struggling with poverty or mental illness or substance use or so many other challenges that too often have been defaulted into our criminal justice system. These are leaders who are using data and evidence and equity to try to address racial disparities in our justice system and the old way of doing business. And we know that they are doing this at a critical moment in our country as we face more than one challenge, any one of which alone would have been enough to overwhelm us, but together really form a tremendous mounting set of hurdles to overcome. We know we face a global pandemic that is sweeping through this country in a way that it's not hitting any other nation in the world. And we know that these prosecutors are committed to ensure that every member of their community, including those behind bars, remains safe and healthy in the midst of this pandemic, at a time when, unfortunately, our prisons and jails have become the largest hotspots for the spread of this pandemic in the nation. As the gatekeepers of the justice system, these prosecutors decide who comes in, for how long, and what their trajectory will be through the justice system. And as elected leaders, they have a bully pulpit to stand up for doing what's right. We also know that we're facing a nation where faith in law enforcement and the rule of law is at an all-time low, and when calls for racial equity in the voices of hundreds of thousands that are taken to our streets have never been louder. We know that we have a tremendous growing frustration with concerns about accountability for police and the conduct of police. And these leaders, again, are rising up to those challenges. Virginia finds itself at the forefront of a movement of 21st century prosecutors. And we now have, I believe, not 11, but actually 12 Commonwealth's attorneys who have come together representing nearly half of the population of the state in the new Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice. And these three Commonwealth's attorneys are leaders in that group. They're addressing issues like mandatory minimums, police accountability, fortifying the discretion of prosecutors, and how we think about our justice system overall. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to these three incredible and inspiring leaders and ask each of you first, and I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, since you are, I won't say the oldest, but the longest serving Commonwealth's attorney in the group. And I'm making no comment about age in any of this, but I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about why you decided to embark on what is necessarily a challenging job, and what have been some of the hurdles and barriers that you've faced on that journey?
Thank you, Miriam. And there's no place I'd rather be right now than with my colleagues who are doing some truly important work, as we can see on today, of all days in our nation. One of the things that has never been lost on me as somebody who is a Black woman first, a mother of four, is that there is, systemic racism within the criminal legal system that the members of our profession traditionally have not acknowledged. There are communities that look like me, and communities, who are poor and who are marginalized, who just have not been invested in our country. And interestingly, as you bring up age or tenure, I'm now 36, but when I first started out, I was 30 in 2014 when I first started running. And a lot of people thought I was young, but what they didn't realize was that I had a real understanding of what was happening in our community, seeing many people who I had gone to school with matriculating through the criminal legal system, and seeing what lack of resources, lack of community investment does to people and to their lives. And then what the impact is on community of mass incarceration, of school to prison pipeline, and truly wanting to serve the community where I was born and raised in a way where my office would do the work of restorative justice, of trying to undo the harms of the past and stopping them from going forward, and really trying our best to invest in community and to turn around the way our criminal legal system functions so that it is truly a system of justice, which is not what we have right now. So all of that was, my way of saying that I truly wanted to be a servant, and not a prosecutor. So of course we know the job is prosecution, but I think I'm a public servant before a prosecutor. So I am, at all times committed to doing any and everything, regardless of what resources I have or don't have, to invest in my community, to end mass incarceration, and to begin a healing process for the members of our community and our nation who just, quite frankly, have not had an opportunity to heal from systemic racism for as long as we can remember. So I very much look forward to this conversation, and I think all of us are aligned in our purpose, and I'm very glad to be having this discussion and doing all this today with you guys.
Thanks, Stephanie, and I think we can all agree that your community is very lucky to have you in that position. Jim, you obviously had kind of that unexpected path after decades as a public defender of, now being on the other side of the courtroom. So tell us about your journey and any of the challenges and barriers that that you've encountered.
Well, there are really two basic reasons that I ended up running for office as a Commonwealth's attorney. First is I was pretty angry at the prosecutor who was in office. And I was pretty angry at the prosecutor because he was fueling the mass incarceration machine. And the way I saw it was that this is an election about community values. And he was not, in my view, in accord with community values. So I thought that one reason that prosecutors are elected in Virginia and many places is that the voters, the members of the community, have a say on what the values are that are going to be put forth in our criminal justice system. So I ran against him for that reason. The other thing that motivated me to run is something that you've mentioned. I have 44 years experience as a criminal defense lawyer, and I have 25 of those years I was the chief public defender. So I felt like I had a different perspective to offer the community, that I felt that I had learned a lot about what we do wrong, and I had seen it. I knew what we were doing wrong as a community, and I knew that there were alternatives, a different path that we could follow. I knew the people that are caught up in the criminal justice system and how we're squandering opportunities to make changes in their lives that are constructive for them and make the community safer in the long run, because the better that we're able to solve the problems that bring people into contact with the criminal justice system, the less that we're going to have reoffending, and the safer our community is going to be. So really, those are the reasons that I got into it. Barriers going forward, I think a lot of the barriers are ones that we struggle with in terms of the legislation that we have in Virginia right now. The statutes that we have on the books, and I'm excited to say that we do have a legislature that's addressing some of those barriers and making changes. Just one, for example, I think you touched on it in your introduction, mandatory minimums. That's a barrier that we have in statutes. Now, prosecutors can do a workaround that. Prosecutors are inclined, like these on this panel, can do a workaround on that, but other prosecutors can't because they don't feel that they have the discretion to do that. So we need changes at the state level, and we're seeing those changes coming out of the General Assembly right now. So that's exciting.
Thanks, Jim, and we will come back to some of those legislative issues and the work of the new group. And I don't think it's coincidental that those changes are happening, given that there are leaders like the three of you now lighting the fire under those changes. So Parissa, tell us a bit about what motivated you to move into this wild ride and how that journey has played out.
Wild ride is putting it mildly. So as you said, I spent almost 20 years being a public defender. I represented people who were convicted and sentenced to death. And I represented innocent people who were incarcerated for crimes that they didn't commit. And all of that work, I thought about it as helping individuals and their families. And it came to a point where I was looking around at my own, in my own backyard, like Jim, and realized that what was happening in Arlington and the city of Falls Church didn't reflect the values that I had, and that it was time to stop plucking people sort of downstream, as the parable, the famous parable says, but to walk upstream to see why are they there and who's putting them there and why are, what can we do to stop putting them there? And so I ran basically on the platform that not every social problem should be a crime, that not every crime should lead to criminal punishment, that not every criminal punishment should lead to incarceration, and that not every form of incarceration should be so long and so harsh that we haven't left room for rehabilitation and redemption. And like Jim's community and Stephanie's, it was really astonishing that this really spoke to people. And I think people are ready now to start undoing the mass incarceration machine that we've created over the last several decades. And in terms of barriers, I mean, the fact that this group is here is proof that we've come a long way in our criminal legal system. But I think no one can really deny that there's really a lot of work that we still have to do, and that we're not moving maybe as fast as we could. But we are sort of changing hearts and minds about criminal justice across the political spectrum. And we've gotten to a point, I think, where Americans are ready to accept the proposition that we lock up too many people and that we can't incarcerate our way to safety. And, we're making those changes in the legislature, but I think it's equally important, and I want to use my voice to step back and to really critically examine the role that race plays in the stories we tell about crime and criminal justice, because we can change statutes, we can change legislatures, we can change Commonwealth's attorneys, but the fundamental problem that we have and that we haven't confronted really, and we're starting to now, is what I'd call the origin story of crime in America. And that story is inextricably linked to race. And it's an origin story that's long operated on the false and corrosive myth that of Black dangerousness. And so I really am trying to use my voice to change our paradigm and change the way that we even view what the criminal legal system is supposed to do and who is supposed to be in it.
Amazing. And I would say that the way all of you define your job and what led you to it is so very different from the decade and a half I spent as a prosecutor. I think it is a sign of times that have dramatically changed. And I think, as we're all well aware, one thing that has certainly changed, the fact that we are doing this in virtual boxes is reflective of that rather than in person with all of the folks who are listening in Virginia. But one thing that has certainly changed is the pandemic and this health crisis that we're facing. And in the wake of that, I know you all have been thinking long and hard about how do you address those behind bars who stand at tremendously great risk of catching the pandemic when it comes into those facilities from the outside, and then seeing it spread like wildfire. And so want to ask each of you to talk a little bit about, in the wake of the pandemic, what action you took and what impact it had in your local communities and your jails to address the numbers of people who are incarcerated and keep them safe. And let me maybe start with you first, Jim, and then Carissa, I'll go to you next.
Well, as you just pointed out, the population at the jail is a high-risk population and a high risk of COVID transmission. So addressing the number of people at the jail, reducing overcrowding at the jail, becomes really a twofold process. First, it's because we need to reduce the risk of disease transmission in our community. And let's be clear, if we have a problem at the jail, it's a problem for the whole community because people come in and out of jail. Certainly the correctional officers and other people who have business at the jail. So let's not pretend that this is just a problem for the people who are in the jail. So we need to protect the community. And the other aspect of it for me as a progressive prosecutor is we need to be using tools to decarcerate the jail that we should have been using all along. So the effect of this is that once we reduce the population at the jail and reduce the risk of disease transmission in the community because of doing that, that we are also getting, I think, some community buy-in to the concept that we've had too many people in jail to start with. So it's been a terrible thing to have COVID in our communities, but there is one positive that's come out of it, and I think it has built up support in the community for the strategies that we're using to reduce population in the jail. So quickly, what are those strategies? One thing is cash bail, which is an issue that we all know about and are concerned about. We have people in jail who can't get out because of cash bail. Well, we stopped that. So we're getting out more people pre-trial. We're getting out people through recommendations of lower sentences or diversions where they would have ended up in jail under a previous administration. They're not ending up there in the first place under this administration. We've also expanded the use of home electronic incarceration, which is a program where you can serve your sentence, but you can serve it outside the jail under strict supervision. So we've also used other tactics like delayed reporting, furloughs, and so on. But all of these tools that we use go to show that we can safely manage people in the community and reduce the population at the jail and protect the community while we're doing that. So it's been, and in the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, we've reduced the population of the jail to levels that people can't even remember. And I know it's been a quarter of a century or more that we've had that population. And so So we're very pleased that we've been able to accomplish that.
Thanks. Carissa, do you want to talk about the efforts that you've been making?
Absolutely. When it became clear the third week of February that we were stuck with COVID, the sheriff and I and the public defender started talking, and we started getting lists so that we could just start going through and actively finding people that should be released. And some of those people, we started with people who had cash bonds set for them. And from the moment that I came into office on January 1st, we stopped asking for cash bail. And every one of my assistants, when in court, either argues for an individual to be held or released on certain conditions. And Jim mentioned some of those conditions. So we had not been asking for cash bail, but the judges had been imposing it in certain circumstances. So we just started with people who had a $10,000 cash bail set and started calling their defense attorneys and saying, file for reconsideration, we will agree under these conditions. And so we were able within a few weeks, and again, it took a lot of collaboration from the sheriff, and it took a lot of collaboration from the public defender and the defense bar, but we were able to reduce the jail population by 30%. And if we can do that and have people out on conditions in the in the middle of a pandemic, there's no reason why we can't do that every day. And so we're monitoring the numbers. We're making sure that we keep up the work. I don't think we're going to be able to get it any lower, because it's like in Albemarle and Charlottesville, nobody remembers it being this low. And then once we got through the cash bail folks, we turned our attention to the people who had 3 months left on their sentences. And we turned our attention to people who had a year left on their sentences in the DOC. And so we actually, supported conditional pardons. We supported early release and resentencing in our courts. And so if somebody is safe to be released in a year, they're safe to potentially be released now under most circumstances, and under certain conditions. So that was basically our strategy. And somebody said, oh, the Commonwealth, the courts are closed, mostly the Commonwealth's attorneys must be getting a break. And I think we were actually working harder than ever, because we were actively finding people that should be released. And we're one of the few agencies that has had no positives, knock on wood.
Stephanie, let me maybe use one of Chris's comments about safe release and return to the community to bridge to some important work that you've been doing. I know that you, from early on in your tenure, really took on and owned the issue of how do you ensure that people, when they do come back to the community, find themselves on a better pathway. And it's not an area where traditionally elected prosecutors have been willing to engage, but I think you rightfully recognize that if you're really about keeping your community safe, this is just critical. So talk about some of the work that you and under your leadership, your office, have done in that area.
So one of the things that very early on in 2015 I did was establish a program called Control Alt Delete, which you guys know what that does on a computer. So it really is about, as again, people who have been determined prosecutors, and what our profession usually does is lock people up. It's about the exact opposite. It's about not forgetting about people once there has been a conviction, and not taking the responsibility to hold someone accountable and using that to determine that we should just throw a person away and not figure out what happens after the fact. And so for those who either were incarcerated under my administration, and in most cases, those who were incarcerated before, my office and I, and when I say I'm always there for all of these programs, We hold programs in the community and inside prisons, and have been going inside prisons since 2016 to have candid conversations with those who are incarcerated about what it means to re-enter into society and how we can help them be successful, how we can help direct them exactly where the resources are. You know, going inside, providing them with job preparedness seminars inside, talking to them about business formation, talking to them about the impact of fines and fees, talking about the importance of rights restorations, and just generally being a support system that's not usually there. And so that is something that has been a commitment to not just go in and take a tour and feel real good about ourselves as prosecutors, but really going in, engaging. And I have formed friendships. I have one guy who's a very close friend who's come out after serving 20 years, who now is in the school system, has a foundation called Give Back to the Block, where we support him at every turn as he tries to keep people from going down that path. And that's not even talking about those who have conviction integrity issues. So it has been, you know, one of the highlights of my career to do this work, not just because of the service that we're providing, but because of the impact that I've seen it have on me and the members of my office as we engage with people who have been incarcerated, and we see that these are people's family members. And that, you know, should be really solidifying the importance of everybody who's a prosecutor as they do this work, looking at those who come before them and saying, this is somebody's family member. I should treat them how I would want my brother or my sister, my mother, father to be treated, and focus on how we hold people accountable without leaning towards incarcerating ourselves out of all problems. And sometimes that means, how do we shift to another agency? How do we shift to a community model? What do we do to lean away from incarceration? So that has been something that is extremely important, and our work continues to grow in that area. And just to go back to what Parissa said, one of the things that is really important that I took away from you, and that I also did when COVID-19 hit, was that we partnered up with the public defenders. And I think it's important for people to hear that sometimes you don't just stand by. Sometimes you say, like my public defender and I did, we're going with joint motion. We're going to identify who is not a threat. And yes, in the back of our heads, like, why are you incarcerated anyway? But we are going to approach the court with joint motion, and we are going to come together to try to do what's right. And Miriam, you know that 2 years ago, we filmed these videos with FAM Foundation about compassionate relief. And so all of these things started coming back that as a system, many had been ignoring, but that we've been talking about, and that everything is coming full circle. And we are now faced with looking in the mirror and deciding what type of leaders we want to be. So all of it is connected. My work with Control Alt Delete has really humanized the people that we work with. And yes, like those who are incarcerated, they are part of our community, and we serve them as well. That work, I will continue to expand on it, and I'm glad to see what my colleagues have been doing as well.
So I want to maybe, given kind of the lens that Stephanie brought to that answer, and the way that, you know, in such a different way, again, than prosecutors of the past, you know, Stephanie, you always think about, you know, this is someone's family. This is, you know, we need to create that proximity. That is a value we haven't always seen in prosecution. That, you know, that humanity, that compassion, and I think what I'd like to do is maybe toss in here, before we move to a different topic, a question that came up from Mary, and we would encourage any of you listening to put questions in the chat room should you have them. But Mary asked about when you all have, in your own way, you know, the origin story that you mentioned, Parissa, and Jim, and you're talking about healing, and Jim, in your comments, and sort of you're being angry at the past administration, and that motivated you to fill this role. In different ways, you've all talked about values. And so Mary asked if you could drill down a little bit into the specific values, community values, that drive you in what you're trying to do, and how those values in the past were not part of the justice system, including how it plays out vis-a-vis systemic racism. So I think it's a great question. Jim, let me maybe start with you and see if you have thoughts on that.
Well, let me follow up on what Stephanie was just talking about. And I think it's a really fundamental value. The community wants criminal behavior to be addressed in a context where people are recognized for who they are and what their circumstances are. In other words, the focus is on a response to criminal behavior that takes into account the people. And so I was angry at the previous prosecutor in my jurisdiction because I think his approach was the opposite. His approach was, you know, a prosecutor is a functionary. A prosecutor is somebody who gets charges placed on his or her desk, mainly by the police, and is responsible for processing those without regard to thinking about crime in the community in a holistic way. So I felt like the community had different values. I certainly had different values, that we need to look at the people who are affected by the criminal process and come up with a different approach. And so there's a lot to that. Let me just let that go because I don't want to take up too much time. But fundamentally, let's look at the people and let's not look at the cases, you know, the processing of cases. So the other value, and this is really important, it's again fundamental to all that we're talking about in this moment in our country, is racial equity. And that is a fundamental value in our community, I believed, and it is. And I want to just speak briefly about something that's that we have in our community that other communities don't have, that's going to help us as we address racial equity. And that is, in Albemarle County and Charlottesville, we have just completed a study of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And it's enormous. It's an enormous value. It tells us what I think most of us already knew about where those racial disparities exist, but they back up our understanding of race and criminal justice with actual data and study. So that's a tool that we're going to be using going forward. And just briefly again, one of the recommendations of that study is that we need more data to be able to understand how the system works. And one of the places that's missing data is the prosecutor's office. We have no way of evaluating whether our charging decisions, our plea agreements, our sentencing recommendations are affected by race. Now, we think that we are good people and I have the best intentions and hope that they're not affected by race, but we have no concrete data that tells us that. So one of the things I ran on, one of the values that I put in front of the community in this past election, was that we need to have transparency in the prosecutor's office. We need to collect that data and be able to show how prosecution decision-making is unbiased, if it is. And if it's not unbiased, we need to address how we're going to resolve that problem. So transparency and data collection in terms of addressing racial equity is something that we're working hard on.
So if I had to pick one value that the community has expressed over the last year or two, would be dignity. And I would say that the dignity of all people, which sort of encompasses the equity issues that Jim was talking about, but also encompasses the idea that people are more than the worst thing that they've ever done. And also encompasses the notion that victims, aren't just a piece of our case, but are much more, and that their wishes need to be honored so that we can really find paths to healing. And one of the things that the community has been, all in on here is restorative justice. And I talked about restorative justice while I was campaigning, and we were able to get an executive on loan from the Annie Casey Foundation to work with the county to set up restorative justice in the legal system, in the community, and in the schools. And we're at the very beginning of that process. But the idea is if we have restorative justice in the schools and we have restorative justice in the community, that will prevent a lot of people from ending up in the criminal legal system to begin with. And then to have the restorative justice in the legal system will help us really get to true accountability, which is more than just sitting passively in a cage, and also to true healing for victims, because the process of going through a court case is incredibly painful and re-traumatizing. And the idea of restorative justice is to really address what victims need to heal, and how we can hold the people who did harm accountable in ways that are meaningful, and ways that require them to do transformative work to make sure that they don't do that harm again.
Amazing. Thank you both. I think I want to transition, Stephanie, to another area where you really have been, as I mentioned at the outset, one of the models in the nation of what police accountability can and should be about. And in many ways, it's appropriate and bittersweet that we're having this conversation on a day where, I think the loved ones and community that so loved and cared about Breonna Taylor would rightfully, I think, probably say, there just has not been true healing or systemic reform or, really a finish line of justice in that case. So I'd like to ask you, to offer any thoughts you have, both perhaps, if you'd like, as they relate to the case involving Breonna Taylor or far too many others whose names we need to keep top of mind, but also, to talk more generally at this moment when trust is at a low. How do we rebuild that trust, and what does true reform and revisioning of police need to look like?
So one, my heart just goes out to Breonna Taylor's mother and her family and her loved ones, and really the entire nation. I know so many people who are hurting right now because of not just the outcome today that came out of the grand jury, but the lack of understanding about what's happening, what feels like a slap in the face. Because, again, while there is an indictment, it doesn't appear to be related to any harm that was done to the person of Breonna Taylor, but rather to property that didn't relate to her. And just, it feels like hopelessness when people see a tragedy like this, that so many in positions of power and so many who have voice are speaking out against and demanding justice for. And then, to feel like nothing will ever happen the right way, in a way that, or even in a way that people can break down and understand, it's just harmful to our nation. It's harmful to progress. And truly, it directly ties to the lack of trust, because quite frankly, the members of my profession and our profession and the members of the law enforcement community have not earned that trust. It just hasn't happened. As a nation, as a system, there are far, fewer prosecutors who are of the mind that we are than there are those who are traditionally of the mindset that this is the way the system has operated, and therefore we will continue to operate in this way under the shroud of secrecy, where even if we have reached a decision that many people may not agree with, we're not even going to help them understand why. And so it's a real blow to the hearts of the people who are awaiting justice. And it's a real blow to the building of trust for our profession. And I say this as someone, not just sitting from afar who hasn't gotten in the trenches, but I say this as a prosecutor who has indicted multiple times, twice, for on-duty shooting and who has prosecuted for an on-duty shooting that resulted in the death of my community member, William Chapman II. And again, not as someone who just oversaw it as the prosecutor in the office, but someone who personally sat as first chair on the case and tried the case. And so I know that justice can be had. I know that these fights can be won, quote unquote, if you want to call it a win, which we never can win when we lose someone's life. But it goes to what Parissa said. We have to have dignity enough for families. We have to have dignity enough for community to come off of our high horse and make clear to our communities what is happening. And I can't, I've had many people reaching out to me today saying to me, tell me what is going on, make sense of this for me. I can't understand. And unfortunately, I have to say to them, I cannot make sense of something that does not make sense to me. So, my heart is hurting. I have a lot of thoughts, and hopefully that came across clear enough. But the reality is that our profession has a whole lot of work to do in order to earn the trust that it just quite frankly has not rightfully earned of the community for the past several years. And I'm proud to stand up with this group and everybody who I'm looking at here who is doing the business of earning that trust and trying to get it right and looking at pushing for legislative reform where, quite specifically in Virginia, we have as a group, this Virginia Progressive Prosecutors for Justice, advocated for reform in the area of no not warrants. And we have spoken Breonna Taylor's name as we've done this. So we stand shoulder to shoulder in this fight to right the wrongs of our profession. And I am truly hurt and saddened by the way we have seen this Breonna Taylor case play out today. And I'm glad that it has been acknowledged and that we have made it a part of this conversation, because I truly feel that we had to.
If I can, I think what the grand jury's verdict shows is two things. The first is that, we really need to go back to why Breonna Taylor's life wasn't valued as much as property. And that goes back to the origin story and the need to really address what we've been saying for 400 years about race. And the fact that we have essentially criminalized skin color. The other thing that I think the particular lack of transparency around this really reinforces the notion that like prosecutors put their thumb on the scale. And I can't speak to what exactly happened in this particular case, but prosecutors control what gets presented to the grand jury. And it's a little bit different in different systems in Virginia in particular, but a grand jury can't think about evidence that's not presented to them. And they can't think about evidence that is presented to them in a certain way as something else. Like they're constrained by the narrative that is told to them. And so this sort of goes back to why our stories are important, because everything that we build our system around, who is dangerous, who is valuable, who, whose life we're going to vindicate, is all built around the stories that we tell about who we are. And like Stephanie, I can't make sense of this either. I mean, I'm sitting here, in the back of my head also struggling with, what do I say to my staff about this? And the only thing I can come up with, like Stephanie, is that I can't make sense of it. And it's really sad.
Jim, I know that as we think about kind of what do we learn from today, from so many other cases where the system failed us. Part of thinking about that is legislative change. How do we change the starting point of our laws, as well as what you all do as the practices day to day in your offices. And you mentioned earlier one of the legislative advancements that happened over this past session, but we know that there were quite a few initiatives that were part of the agenda of the group that you all are so ably leading, along with 9 other of your colleagues, a mighty dozen in the state. So if you can maybe talk a bit about, that legislative agenda and what was left on the table, what are you hoping to be able to accomplish in future years?
The Progressive Prosecutors Group did have a legislative agenda, and of course, I think we had broader goals as well. But Stephanie mentioned one thing, which is the no-knock warrants, changing in the process where no-knock warrants are issued. So that's one thing that's been presented to the legislature. And there's kind of an omnibus bill that's in the legislature now on basically policing and police conduct. I don't believe that the final action has been taken on that, but I think it's moving along and is likely to when the session is finished, it's likely to be passed. So that's one big issue. It has a lot of subparts. But another thing that the Progressive Prosecutors have advocated for is something that I think is in a more general sense. It goes to the work that we do as prosecutors. So we've advocated to clarify discretionary prosecutors' powers. And we've also, along with that, asked for the legislature to give us an expansion in the number of cases that can be deferred. They're called deferred disposition cases. So those two things, greater power to exercise discretion and acknowledgement that deferred disposition is a good alternative that we can use in the criminal justice system. Those two powers taken together, which have been reinforced at Senate Bill 5033, it's passed the Senate and it's passed the House Courts of Justice Committee, so it's going to go into law. Those equip us as prosecutors to make decisions that are different than in the past. Decisions that we do not want to prosecute some cases. Some jurisdictions are getting pushback on that. If this law goes through, and I'm sure it will, then it's made clear by the legislature that we have the responsibility and the right to make decisions about things that we want to expend community resources on in terms of prosecutions and things that we don't. So we've been given that power to make those decisions, which are in the, going back to earlier comments, that are reflective of the values of the community. The other thing about deferred dispositions is, they're available now in some limited circumstances. Drug court is one of those circumstances, but they have to be specifically set forth in the code. Right now, this proposal allows us generally to look at deferring dispositions, having a person participate in a program without getting a conviction. So those are really, to me, one of the most important legislative changes that is going to come out of this legislature.
Thanks, Jim. And I think that's a good segue, as is some of the chatter in the chat room that I want to touch on in a second. But, a good segue that, changing laws and changing paradigms needs voices from the community and support from the community. And I also just want to kind of acknowledge before I ask you all on what can the community do to help you all bring about change? How can they support you as you try to support them and their vision of justice? But I also want to acknowledge, I'm seeing some of these comments in the chat room that, again, as someone who prosecuted decades ago, this is an amazing moment where, in particular, women and women of color are breaking through glass ceilings, shattering them, and stepping into these positions. And, You know, I think, as Parissa said, you know, there would be no Parissa without Stephanie, and maybe there would be no Stephanie without, you know, Marilyn Mosby, or, you know, or others before her. That, you know, you all, and Jim, I don't mean to leave you out of this, but maybe I do. But, you know, you all are paving pathways for others who are going to follow. And you all are sort of the pebbles in the stream, and the waves that you're creating are going to enable future generations, you know, especially of women of color, to see themselves and say, I can do this, and I too can lead my community. So, so with that, and Chris, and maybe Stephanie, I'm going to start Parissa with you on this, but Stephanie, maybe you can give people the link in the chat room to Control-Alt-Delete, so that they can find that information as well. But Parissa, let me start with you. How can these folks who are listening, how can people in the community help you all bring about change?
So I never believed the adage that all politics is local until I started running for a local office. But it really is. I mean, especially the criminal justice system. Like we don't have one criminal legal system. We have like over 2,000, because we are a patchwork quilt of what a community wants. And this goes back to what Jim said at the beginning, which is that we are elected to reflect the values of our community. And as such, you know, I would say, you know, get involved in your city councils and your county boards, and, you know, let the people who run your locality and who hold the purse strings know what you want to see in your community. Pay attention to who your DA is. I mean, in Virginia, we're Commonwealth's attorneys. In Maryland, it's state's attorneys. In other jurisdictions, it's a DA, but it's all the same thing. It is the person who is the top law enforcement person in your jurisdiction. Pay attention to who those people are and what they're doing, and write to them and tell them what you want to see in your community. I don't always listen to the feedback that I get, but I pay attention to it, and I pay attention to it because the voice of the community matters. So I would just say, get involved as much as you can with every local office that you can, and let them know what you want and where you want your money spent, in terms of social services, in terms of support systems, and in terms of programs like Stephanie's and restorative justice and that sort of thing.
And Stephanie, let me maybe, you know, kind of as the veteran in the group, turn it back to you for any closing words or insights you want to add before we wrap up.
So I will say, this is like not a political statement, but Marilyn and I came the same year in 2015. So I would say there would be no Stephanie Morales if not for Kamala Harris. So I just will say this, you know, we have so much work to do that it truly is going to take every last one of us to do it. And so to me, that means that we must have community. This is an outside and inside game. There is no way that those of us who are working within the system will get this right without both pressure from the outside and also engagement. And so that means like accountability should not be seen as a negative thing. And so when, you know, I say to people, hold your elected officials accountable, including me, that doesn't mean that we should be yelling and screaming. That just means that accountability is a form of engagement where you are demanding that, you know, the things that we were given a mandate to do when we ran for office and we said we wanted restorative justice or we wanted Control-Alt-Delete, that we're delivering on those services to the community, but also that we're continuing to engage and learn and grow. And so all my programs, that our Future Leaders initiatives where we engage with young people, you know, we've now started a conviction integrity review process. All of these things are an extension of the growth of our office as a result of what our community needs. And so I just say, like, however, it gets done, walk hand in hand with us. It's not your job to come and always have to find us. We should be reaching out to you. And so when we do reach out and we extend that hand and we want to engage, please engage with us and be a part of, a voice that traditionally is not heard. Because when we as prosecutors want to see power and give voice to those who don't have voice, we need somebody to stand up and speak. So those of you who have been personally impacted, those of you who have engaged and want to provide resources, now is the time where all of us truly have to work together to change this system, to transform it. Because what we have seen is that this system is working exactly the way it's designed to, and that is going to continue to do harm. So my call to action is that everybody just be ready to put your boots on, and like, we're going into the trenches together.
Well, amazing parting words. And let me now again thank all of you for this incredible conversation as it reflects the work you're doing every day. So important at this moment. And Chelsea, let me turn it over to you for any parting words on behalf of TomTom. And I know that you're going to be letting folks know about sort of the follow-up reception that hopefully people will take the time and have a chance to network with each other.
Yeah, I'd like to thank each of you first off for sharing your insights and expertise. This was such a wonderful conversation, and I'd also like to thank everyone who attended today for being a part of the conversation. If you enjoyed the session, please consider becoming a contributing member to the foundation. You can do so on our website, tomtomfoundation.org/give. We have one more day of criminal justice reform programs, and they'll be shining a light on new models for public safety and support for the formerly incarcerated. Immediately following this session is a meet and greet hosted by Aspen Institute's first communicator in residence and an expert facilitator, Danielle Christine Toussaint. The link for that is in the chat, and you can click it now to join. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Without their support, none of this would be possible. And today's session was brought to you by Siebel Weekly. Thank you all again, and see you soon.
It's great, 'cause it's the right thing to do. We hear mothers crying, we feel their pain. We see so much dying, no justice for the slain. When lies replace truth, things gotta change. Our Black Lives Matter, say our names. We're gonna stand up for what is right.